So a lot of people wonder why the abbey was actually built here, but it actually is in quite a good location. We have some woods on the south side and we have the marshes on the north side, and the woods would have provided all sorts of facilities for the canons that lived here, in particular water, and they had a reservoir that they built that they actually used to channel the water down into the abbey. The marshland, which they helped drain, was actually also turned into farmland, and that they owned, and that would have provided income for the abbey. So when we look at the church of the abbey, the first thing that you should notice is just how big it actually is. And in fact, it's very similar in size to Rochester Cathedral, and the front of the abbey would have looked very similar to Rochester Cathedral. And the person who founded it was Richard de Lucy. He was the Chief Justiciar to Henry II, and the Chief Justiciar was responsible for the law of the land, and because Henry II was still running Normandy as well as England, Richard de Lucy spent a lot of his time actually running England while Henry II was out in Normandy. But this explains a little bit why he could afford to build an abbey on this scale, because this was, at its time, one of the largest abbeys in the country. In 1909 to 1913, the ruins were actually a farm. So we couldn't see anything that we can see today, and the nave was a pigsty and there were chickens running around. But Alfred Clapham of the Woolwich Antiquarian Society got permission from Christ Church School to excavate the site. While they were doing that, in the Ladies' Chapel, which actually has a crypt underneath it, they found all sorts of amazing relics. One of those is referred to as the de Lucy Knight, and this was so impressive that it now forms a key exhibit in the Victoria and Albert Museum in their monasterial section. It was very, very well preserved because, unlike most relics from that time, it had been buried in the ground, and we can still see on it the different colours, the reds and blues. We can see the chain mail that actually was carved into the effigy. And in actual fact, because we can see that level of detail, we know that although we'd like it to be Richard de Lucy, it isn't, because the armour he's wearing dates it back to the 14th century. So when we look at the abbey today, what we're looking at are excavations that were performed in the early 1950s. The site had been owned by Christ Church School until 1930. At that point, the surrounding area was rapidly being urbanised, and London County Council was very keen to ensure that parkland was retained for the inhabitants. So they bought the land and they started to uncover the ruins of the abbey. They employed proper stonemasons, and the Woolwich Antiquarian Society got involved with Mr. Elliston Irwood to oversee what they were doing. A lot of what you see now is exactly where it would have been, but it has been tidied up slightly. So the ruins, the walls, as you can see as we walk around, have got sort of proper lime cement in them to hold them in place and keep them together for the future. So the only person that we know who is descended from the founder of the abbey, Richard de Lucy, and who is still buried within the abbey, is somebody called Rosia de Dover. Rosia was the great-great-granddaughter of the founder, Richard de Lucy, and her heart is buried in the centre chapel of the north transept. Some people wonder why it is that her heart's buried there, and this actually dates back to the Crusades, which started round about the same time that the Normans were building all the abbeys within Britain. When somebody fell in the Crusades, it wasn't practical to bring their whole body back to England. So what they would do is they would bury them where they fell, and they would take out their heart, desiccate it, put it in a box with some herbs, and then they would bring it back to England so that the relatives in England had something to bury and to cherish. And she actually owned half of the land of the Manor of Lesnes, or Erith as we call it today. So Lesnes was a very big part of her life, and she wanted to be buried here in the abbey that she would have known as she grew up. One of the most familiar parts of an abbey for most people who visit them is the cloister area. And for an abbey, this is a very important part because it's the thoroughfare, it's the road, if you will, that joins all the different parts of the abbey together. So as we look around here, what we can see is that if you want to get to the church and to the dormitory, if you want to get to the refectory, if you want to get into the western range through the door, then you would come through the cloister. The abbey was dissolved in 1525 on the orders of Cardinal Wolsey, and that was to found a college called Cardinal's College that he wanted to create in Oxford. At that point, the abbey began to be dismantled, but one part of the abbey that was retained was the abbot's house, and we don't actually have any of the abbot's house left today to see, apart from a concrete slab and a mulberry tree. The abbot's house was originally built probably in the 16th, 15th century, and it was a much more modern part of the abbey. And so when the abbey was dissolved, it was retained so that the person who then owned the land could live in that house, and it became effectively a manor house for Lesnes. James I, who at that time the silk industry was a really big industry, had decided that he wanted to bring mulberry trees into England and start growing them, and he mandated that everybody who had a manor house had to grow a mulberry tree. So the mulberry tree that we see here is absolutely an indication of where the abbot's house used to be, because it would have been in the garden of the abbot's house. So this area is the dormitory, so it's where the canon would have slept. But it was actually a two-storey building, and you can see it has the tallest parts of the ruins that still remain. And in fact, if you look along those walls, you can actually see the dividing line where the second floor would have been. So what we had underneath the dormitory, because the dormitory was on the first floor, was something called an undercroft, and this typically would have been used in most abbeys for storage. But there is something a little bit mysterious about Lesnes Abbey, because within the undercroft we have a fireplace, and we know that this is the fireplace for what was called the calefactory or warming room. So every abbey, they didn't have central heating when abbeys were built, so the only place that you had fires was generally the kitchen and this one area, the warming room, where in the winter a fire was kept permanently going so that the canon could warm themselves. So all of us have heard of the dissolution of the monasteries, and most of us associate that with Henry VIII. But actually, Lesnes Abbey, the driving force behind the dissolution of Lesnes Abbey, was Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey wanted to create a college in Oxford because at that time, if you wanted to learn about ecclesiastical subjects, you had to go to France. So he wanted to establish a much stronger basis for learning about ecclesiastical things within England. So he found a abbey in Oxford that he thought would be quite a good college, and he approached the Pope and Henry VIII and said, well, can I close certain abbeys because they haven't really got enough canons and some of them didn't have very good reputations. So at that time, Lesnes Abbey had an abbot and 5 canons, and it was on the list. So on the 13th of February 1525, Lesnes Abbey was formally closed. Once the abbey was dissolved, they began dismantling the abbey and taking what was valuable from it. In particular, the lead on the roof. There is evidence near the Western Range that the lead was melted from the roof, was melted in that area. There's evidence of burnt ground that was uncovered during some of the digs. Cardinal Wolsey, unfortunately though, didn't actually last very long. So he then fell out with Henry VIII and he actually died of natural causes before he could be executed. So the abbey became the property of King Henry VIII, who interestingly actually then gave it to somebody called Beresford, who, if you know all about Anne Boleyn, will know that he was Anne Boleyn's brother and was accused of sleeping with Anne Boleyn. So he didn't last as the owner very long either. There was a trail of people who owned the abbey until a member of Parliament called Hippersley. And he's quite famous because he was the first person to carry out any excavations within the abbey. He was really looking to get more stone out because at that time they were still quarrying the abbey for stone to build walls and other buildings in the area. But he reportedly found the tomb of Richard de Lucy in the ruins, and at the time the contemporary reports say that the body was quite well preserved and still had some hair attached to its skull. Unfortunately, Hippersley was very badly in debt and he only stayed as the owner of the abbey for around 2 years. During that time he put a lot of the artefacts that he found on display, but when he died he reported that he'd buried them all and the body of Richard de Lucy under a bay tree in the church. Now, what we know is that at that time many people thought that the church was the refectory because the refectory has a pulpit in it and the refectory is on the north side of the cloister. Typically in an abbey design the church was always built on the north side because otherwise it blocked out the sun from the cloister, making it very cold. So the bay tree that we see today within the refectory could be the area where Hippersley originally reburied or reinterred Richard de Lucy. We set up these tours as the Friends of Lesnes Abbey just last year, just in September 2021. And we've been doing these now at farmers markets since then. If you want to find out about them and join one of our tours, the best thing to do is to go to Eventbrite, search for Lesnes Abbey, and then you'll find out all the events that are occurring here, including our walking tours.